I stood in the doorway of my parents' modest suburban home, keys dangling from my fingertips, watching as my father helped my mother from their decade-old sedan. The medical bills were stacked on the kitchen counter where I'd sorted them earlier, a tall tower of debt that could crush anyone, but especially two retired teachers with insufficient insurance. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same parents who drained my college fund 12 years ago because your brother needs it more were now dependent on the daughter they'd deemed financially expendable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant at the architectural firm where I was now a partner. Another client impressed with the designs I'd created despite working my way through college one excruciating semester at a time. I silenced my phone and stepped outside to help my mother up the walkway. Her eyes, once sharp and critical, now clouded with medication and what might have been regret. "Thank you for coming, Eliza," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. I nodded, swallowing, the words that had been trapped in my throat for over a decade. "Let's get you inside, Mom," I said instead. "The nurse will be here in an hour." My life hadn't always been defined by this bitter symmetry of need and resentment. There was a time when I believed my parents saw me, really saw me, and valued what they saw. But that illusion shattered during my senior year of high school, when I discovered that the college fund they'd promised me since childhood had been emptied and redirected to my younger brother, Mason. I still remember that day with painful clarity. Sitting at our kitchen table surrounded by college acceptance letters, Northwestern, Cornell, UC Berkeley, schools I'd poured my heart into applying for, institutions that had recognized my potential enough to welcome me into their halls. My parents had entered with solemn faces, my father clutching a manila folder like it contained radioactive material. "Eliza, we need to talk about your college plans," my mother had said, her voice steady, but her eyes avoiding mine. I'd smiled, gesturing to the spread of letters before me. "I know. I can't believe I got into almost everywhere I applied. I'm leaning toward Northwestern for their architecture program, but Berkeley's offering a partial scholarship that—" "Honey," my father interrupted, "there's been a change in the financial situation." The conversation that followed altered the trajectory of my life. My college fund, nearly $80,000 saved over 18 years, had been transferred to my brother. Mason, 3 years younger, had been diagnosed with a learning disability that my parents insisted required specialized schools and programs that insurance wouldn't cover. "He needs it more than you do," my mother explained, her tone suggesting, this conclusion was as obvious as gravity. "You've always been so capable, Eliza. You can apply for scholarships, take out loans. You'll find a way." "But you promised," I whispered, feeling the future I'd planned crumbling beneath me. "I've been counting on this. I've made all my decisions based on—" "Life isn't fair," my father cut in, his voice hardening. "Mason will struggle his entire life if he doesn't get the right support now. You're smart enough to succeed regardless. Why can't you understand that?" That night, I'd cried until my eyes swelled shut, curled around my acceptances letters that now seemed like cruel jokes. But by morning, something had crystallized within me, a determination that would become my North Star. If I had to forge my path alone, then I would. And I would never again expect anything from the people who should have been my strongest advocates. I deferred my enrollment at the state university, the only option remotely affordable without the promised fund and worked 3 jobs for a year to save enough for my first semester's tuition. When I finally started college, I maintained a punishing schedule. Full course load by day, waitressing and bartending by night, freelance graphic design work on weekends. I qualified for some financial aid, but not enough. Student loans piled up, but I refused to drop out. Meanwhile, Mason attended an expensive private school with specialized programs, then a liberal arts college known more for its scenic campus than academic rigor. My parents beamed in Facebook photos at his mediocre achievements, while I couldn't even afford to travel home for holidays, working double shifts instead to pay for textbooks and rent. The most painful part wasn't the struggle itself. It was knowing that my potential had been deemed less valuable, my dreams more dispensable. Each semester was a battle not just against financial hardship, but against the nagging voice that whispered, maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't worth the investment. I pushed that voice down with every Dean's List announcement, every professor's commendation, every design competition I won while running on 4 hours of sleep. I graduated with honors and $97,000 in student loan debt. No one from my family attended the ceremony. Mason had a swim meet that weekend. Looking back now, as I helped my mother into the house she could no longer afford, I recognized that day as the first in a pattern that would define our relationship for years to come. My achievements were expected. Mason's celebrated. My independence was assumed. Mason's dependence accommodated. My help was counted on. Mason's was never requested. After graduation, I'd landed an entry-level position at a respected architectural firm in Chicago, 600 miles from my hometown of Mapleton, Pennsylvania. Distance became my ally, allowing me to reduce our interactions to holiday phone calls and the occasional obligatory visit. I threw myself into my career with the same intensity that had gotten me through college, climbing from junior designer to project manager to associate in record time. Each promotion, each raise went first to paying down my student debt, then to building the financial security my parents had denied me. I lived frugally in a small apartment, drove a used car, and invested aggressively. By 32, I was debt-free and had purchased my first property, a converted warehouse loft I was renovating myself. My parents called occasionally, but our conversations remained superficial. They'd share stories about Mason, now working sporadically at our father's former school as a substitute teacher, still living in their converted basement, still requiring their financial support despite being 29 years old. They never asked about my life beyond pleasantries, as if my success was an uncomfortable reminder of what they'd sacrificed. Then, 3 months ago, the call came that changed everything. My father's voice, usually confident to the point of arrogance, trembled as he delivered the news. My mother had suffered a severe stroke. The prognosis was uncertain, but the financial reality was crystal clear. Their insurance would cover only a fraction of her care, and their retirement savings were insufficient for the specialized rehabilitation she would need. "We need your help, Eliza," he'd admitted, the words seemingly painful to pronounce. I'd stood in my sun-drenched kitchen, staring out at the Chicago skyline, and felt a strange calm descend. This moment, this request, had been inevitable. Part of me had been waiting for it, perhaps even expecting it. The symmetry was too perfect, the reversal of dependencies too poetic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What about Mason?" I'd asked, already knowing the answer. My father's sigh carried through the phone. He's not in a position to help financially. He's been between jobs again, and you know he's never been good with money. Of course, the child they'd sacrificed everything for, including my future, couldn't help them when they needed it most, but I could. I, who had been deemed strong enough to succeed without their support, was now their only hope. "I'll need to look at your finances," I'd said, my voice professional, detached. "All of them. And I'll need power of attorney to make healthcare decisions if Mom's condition deteriorates." "Eliza, that's not necessary." "It is if you want my help." The firmness in my tone surprised even me. "I'm not writing blank checks, Dad. If I'm going to do this, I'm doing it my way." Now, 3 months later, I was managing not only my thriving career from a temporary remote work arrangement, but also my parents' care and financial reconstruction. I'd taken a leave of absence from the firm, sublet my Chicago loft, and moved temporarily back to Mapleton to oversee my mother's rehabilitation and untangle the mess of my parents' finances. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. They'd remortgaged their paid-off home twice, once for Mason's college, once for his failed attempt at starting a sports memorabilia business. Their credit cards were maxed out from covering his rent when he'd lost previous jobs. Their retirement accounts had been drawn down prematurely, incurring substantial penalties. And most shocking of all, they'd taken out a high-interest loan against my father's pension to help Mason avoid bankruptcy 2 years earlier. All told, they were over $300,000 in debt, with my mother's medical bills adding more every day. Their financial sacrifice for Mason hadn't ended with my college fund. It had continued unabated throughout their retirement years, draining resources they desperately needed now. I'd confronted my father with the statements spread across their dining room table, watching as shame crept across his face. "You gave him everything," I said quietly. "Everything you had, everything I had. And where is he now?" My father looked away. "He's your brother, Eliza. And I'm your daughter. Did you ever think about what would happen when you got older? Did you ever think about who would take care of you when all your money was gone?" He had no answer for that. Mason had visited the hospital exactly twice during our mother's 3-week stay, both times for less than an hour. He'd made vague promises about helping out, but conveniently disappeared when actual help was needed. When I'd finally cornered him and asked directly what he planned to contribute to our parents' care, he'd looked at me with genuine confusion. "I thought you were handling all that," he'd said. "You're the one with the fancy job and no kids. I can barely make rent as it is." I'd stared at him, this 30-year-old man-child who had been given every advantage at my expense, and felt a cold clarity wash over me. This wasn't just about my parents anymore. This was about breaking a cycle of enablement that had damaged all of us in different ways. "Things are going to change around here," I'd told him. "Starting now." Back in the present, I helped my mother to her bedroom, now converted into a first-floor recovery suite based on the occupational therapist's recommendations. My father hovered anxiously in the doorway. "The home health aide will be here at 9 tomorrow morning," I informed him, adjusting my mother's pillows. "I've scheduled a meeting with the financial advisor for tomorrow afternoon to discuss liquidating your vacation property. The small cabin in the Poconos, their pride and joy, purchased when I was in high school, was their last significant asset. Selling it would provide enough to pay off the most pressing medical bills and create a cushion for ongoing care." My father's face fell at the mention of selling, but he nodded without argument. "And Dad," I added, my voice level. "I've scheduled an apartment viewing for Mason tomorrow at 2. The rent is within what he can afford on his substitute teaching income, and it's closer to the school. He needs to be out of the basement by the end of the month." This got a reaction. "Eliza, be reasonable. Your brother can't—" "My brother can and will," I interrupted, straightening to my full height. "I've drawn up a financial plan for this family, and it only works if everyone contributes. I'm not asking him to pay for Mom's care, but he needs to support himself fully. The enabling ends now." "We were just trying to help him," my mother murmured from the bed, her speech slightly slurred from the stroke. "He's always needed extra support." I looked at her, this woman who had once told me I was strong enough to make it on my own, and felt the weight of everything unsaid between us. "I know, Mom, but supporting someone doesn't mean sacrificing everything, including your own security. It means helping them become self-sufficient." I didn't add what we all knew, that their form of help had left Mason dependent and entitled, my childhood dreams altered forever, and them financially broken when they needed resources most. Some lessons were too painful to articulate. That night, after my parents had gone to sleep, I sat on their back porch with a glass of wine, staring up at the same stars I'd gazed at as a teenager, dreaming of a future that had been reshaped without my consent. My phone buzzed with a text from my colleague Jessica back in Chicago. "How's the family crisis management going? Everyone at the firm misses you. That Cleveland project keeps hitting snags without your eye on it." I smiled faintly. There was my real life waiting for me to return. The career I'd built despite every obstacle, the reputation I'd earned through relentless work and undeniable talent. My parents' need for me now didn't erase the pain of their choices, but it had granted me something unexpected, a chance to reshape our family dynamic on my terms. I wasn't helping them out of obligation or even love, though some remnant of that emotion still flickered beneath my resentment. I was helping them because I refused to be the person they had been. Someone who would leave family members to drown when I had the power to offer rescue. Their failure didn't have to become mine. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Mason. "Dad says you're making me move out? That's BS. Where am I supposed to go?" I stared at the message, feeling a familiar anger rise. Then, deliberately, I set the phone aside without answering. Tomorrow would be time enough to begin Mason's education in adulthood. Tonight, under these familiar stars, I allowed myself a moment of recognition. I had come full circle, returning to the home that had launched me into the world without a safety net. But I was not the same person who had left. I was stronger, certainly, but also wiser about the complex tangle of love, obligation, and boundaries that defined family. My parents had made their choices, believing they were doing what was necessary for one child while sacrificing another. Now I was making mine, with clear eyes and a steady hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter they hadn't believed needed their financial support was now the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. The son they'd sacrificed everything for couldn't, or wouldn't, help when they needed it most. But this wasn't about vengeance or even justice. It was about breaking patterns that had harmed us all. As I sipped my wine and listened to the familiar chorus of suburban night sounds, I made a promise to myself. I would help my parents rebuild a sustainable life, one that didn't depend on my indefinite support. I would push my brother toward the independence he should have developed years ago. And then, when the crisis had stabilized, I would return to the life I'd fought so hard to create, not out of resentment, but out of self-respect. The college fund they had redirected had altered my path, forcing me to climb a steeper road than necessary. But that road had led me to a strength and self-reliance I might never have discovered otherwise. Perhaps, in some perverse way, I owed them gratitude for that unintended gift. But gratitude didn't require forgetting, and helping didn't require absolution. Some debts, emotional ones, could never truly be repaid. All we could do was move forward, eyes open to both the wounds of the past and the possibilities of the future. I finished my wine and stood, stretching in the cool night air. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and hard boundaries. It would bring resistance and perhaps even anger. But it would also bring one day closer to resolution, to a new family dynamic built on respect rather than convenience. My parents had once decided that my brother needed their financial support more than I did. Now life had decided that they needed my support more than I needed to hold on to old grievances. The symmetry was imperfect but undeniable. As I headed inside, I passed the family photos lining the hallway: Mason's graduation, his sports trophies, his hapless smile in various stages of development. My photos were fewer, my achievements less prominently displayed. That imbalance had once cut deep. Now it seemed almost comically trivial. My accomplishments didn't need their wall space or their recognition. They existed in the world I had, built for myself, in the career I had forged, in the financial security I had created despite their choices. I paused by my mother's door, listening to her breathing. Whatever pain lay between us, I couldn't deny the fundamental human connection that remained. She had failed me when I needed her most, choosing my brother's needs over my future. But perhaps in that failure lay the seeds of my greatest strength. The ability to stand alone, to build without foundation, to trust my own capabilities when no one else would. Tomorrow would be another day of reconstruction, not just of my parents' finances or my mother's physical abilities, but of our entire family dynamic. It would be exhausting, thankless work. But I was used to that. After all, I'd put myself through college one exhausting, thankless day at a time. This time, though, I wasn't fighting just for myself. I was fighting for a future where patterns could be broken, where dependence could transform into capability, where old wounds might never heal completely but could at least stop bleeding. I checked my mother's medication chart one last time, made sure her water was within reach, and headed to the guest room that had once been mine, walls still painted the soft blue I'd chosen at 16. As I lay down in the narrow twin bed, I thought about how far I'd come from the devastated teenager who'd learned her college fund was gone. That girl had believed her parents' actions meant she wasn't enough, not special enough, not needy enough, not loved enough. But the woman I'd become knew better. Their actions had reflected their limitations, not mine. And in transcending the boundaries they'd placed on my potential, I'd discovered my own worth, independent of their recognition. Now they needed me, and that need created an opportunity, not for revenge, but for resolution. Not to settle scores, but to set things right. Not to punish, but to rebuild. Tomorrow would be day one of my family's reconstruction. I closed my eyes, mentally preparing for the resistance I would face, the excuses I would hear, the patterns I would need to break. But tonight, in this moment of quiet before the storm, I allowed myself to acknowledge a simple truth. The daughter they had deemed strong enough to succeed without support had indeed succeeded, beyond anything they could have imagined. And now that very success was the lifeline they desperately needed. Sometimes justice arrives in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving someone wrong. It's proving yourself right. 6 years after that devastating conversation at my parents' kitchen table, I stood on the stage at my graduation ceremony, the weight of my architecture degree almost unreal in my hands. The auditorium buzzed with proud families, tearful parents, and the electric excitement of possibility. I scanned the crowd briefly, knowing I wouldn't find the faces I'd once hoped would be there. My row of seats remained empty, as I'd expected. Mason's regional swimming competition had taken priority. Professor Winters, my thesis advisor, squeezed my shoulder as I exited the stage. Exceptional work, as always, Eliza. Any firm would be lucky to have you. I smiled, grateful for his mentorship. While my parents had been absent, there had been others, professors who recognized my talent, employers who valued my work ethic, friends who understood my drive. They had become my chosen family, the people who saw me when my biological family looked past me. Later that evening, as my classmates celebrated with their families, I sat alone in my tiny apartment surrounded by architectural models and half-packed boxes. Chicago awaited me. Mercer and Associates had offered me an entry-level position starting in 2 weeks. My phone rang, displaying my parents' number. I hesitated before answering. "Congratulations, honey." My mother's voice was cheerful, as if her absence today was inconsequential. "We're so proud of you." "Thanks," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "How was Mason's competition?" "Oh, he did wonderfully, placed third in the 100-meter butterfly. Everyone was so impressed, especially considering his challenges." Of course they were. I closed my eyes, fighting the familiar surge of resentment. "That's great. We took some video if you want to see it. Maybe when you come home next weekend to pack up the rest of your things?" I glanced around my apartment. Everything I owned already in boxes or sold. There was nothing left at my parents' house except painful memories. "Actually, I'm driving straight to Chicago tomorrow. The firm wants me to start early." "Oh." Her disappointment was performative at best. "Well, we'll miss seeing you, but we understand. You've always been so independent." Independent. The word they used when what they meant was expendable. The daughter who could be counted on to figure things out alone. The child whose dreams could be sacrificed for her brother's needs. "Send Mason my congratulations," I said, ending the call before my carefully constructed composure could crack. That night, I made a decision that would shape the next phase of my life. I would build a wall between my past and my future. Chicago would be my fresh start, unencumbered by the weight of familial disappointment. I would visit on major holidays, only keep conversations superficial, and invest my emotional energy in people who valued me. It wasn't about punishing my parents, it was about protecting myself, about recognizing that some wounds couldn't heal with continued exposure to the source of injury. My first year at Mercer and Associates tested everything I'd learned about resilience. Junior architects were expected to work punishing hours for modest pay, competing for opportunities to contribute meaningfully to significant projects. But compared to putting myself through college while working multiple jobs, it felt almost manageable. I found an affordable studio apartment in a developing neighborhood, furnished it sparsely from secondhand stores, and funneled every spare dollar toward my student loans. My colleagues went out for expensive dinners and weekend getaways. I packed lunches and explored free museums. They complained about entry-level salaries, I budgeted with the precision of someone who knew exactly what it meant to have nothing. Within 18 months, I'd caught the attention of Sophia Mercer herself, the firm's formidable founder. She assigned me to assist on the Lakefront Center project, a career-making opportunity for someone at my level. "You have an unusual perspective," she noted after reviewing my preliminary sketches. "Most young architects are either too derivative or too experimental. You found balance, practical enough to be buildable, innovative enough to be remarkable." "I learned early that aesthetics mean nothing without structural integrity," I replied. "Beauty has to be supported by something solid." She studied me with shrewd eyes. "That philosophy will take you far in this field." And it did. By my third year, I was leading small projects. By my fifth, I was managing teams. My designs began winning awards, my name recognition growing within the industry. I moved to a better apartment, then bought a modest condo. I paid off my student loans in 7 years instead of 20, throwing every bonus and raise at the debt that had shadowed my early adulthood. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family settled into a predictable pattern. I called on birthdays and major holidays. I sent appropriate gifts. I listened to updates about Mason's life, his struggles to complete community college, his series of short-lived jobs, his return to living in my parents' basement after a brief, unsuccessful attempt at independence. "He's trying so hard, my wee," Mother would say, her voice a mixture of defense and desperation. "It's just difficult for him to find his place." I never pointed out the obvious, that perhaps Mason struggled precisely because they had never required him to succeed. That their help had become a crutch he couldn't function without. That their financial sacrifices had created not independence, but perpetual dependence. It wasn't my place to criticize their parenting choices, I reasoned. They had made their decisions, and I had made mine. If they wanted to continue pouring resources into a bottomless pit, that was their prerogative. What I didn't realize was how quickly those resources were being depleted. On my 32nd birthday, I was promoted to partner at the firm, the youngest in Mercer's history. I celebrated with colleagues at an upscale restaurant, accepting congratulations and toasting to future projects. My phone buzzed with a text from my father, a simple happy birthday, with no mention of my professional milestone, which I'd shared during our last brief call. I pushed away the familiar sting. This was my moment, my achievement, earned through thousands of hours of dedication and sacrifice. I didn't need their validation to know my worth. 3 weeks later, my father called on a Tuesday evening. Unusual, as our communication typically adhered to a predictable holiday schedule. "Eliza," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Something's happened." My mother had suffered a severe stroke. She was stabilized but facing a long recovery. The prognosis was uncertain, the medical bills mounting, and their insurance was proving woefully inadequate. "We're in a bit of a financial bind," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "The out-of-pocket costs for your mother's rehabilitation are substantial, and our retirement savings." He trailed off, but I understood the unspoken reality. They needed money. My money. The daughter they had deemed capable of managing without their support was now being asked to support them. "I'll need to look over your financial situation," I said, my tone professional rather than emotional. "All of it, before I can determine how best to help." His hesitation was palpable. "Eliza, that's not necessary. If you could just—" "It is necessary," I interrupted. I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with. 2 days later, I took emergency leave from the firm and flew back to Mapleton. The home I entered was not the comfortable middle-class residence I remembered. Signs of financial strain were everywhere: deferred maintenance, outdated appliances, a general air of making do. My mother's medical equipment dominated the living room, where a hospital bed had been set up temporarily. She looked small and fragile, her left side visibly weaker, her speech slurred. The woman who had once seemed so formidable to me, whose approval I had desperately sought, now appeared diminished, not just physically, but essentially. "Eliza," she murmured, reaching for my hand with her functional right one. "You didn't have to come." But I did. Not just out of familial obligation, but because something in me needed to face this situation head-on. Needed to understand how we had arrived at this point of perfect reversal. While my mother napped, my father reluctantly provided access to their financial records. What I discovered shocked even my prepared mind. Their finances weren't just strained, they were catastrophic. The college fund that should have been mine had only been the beginning. Over the years, they had systematically liquidated almost every asset they possessed to support Mason. They had remortgaged their home twice, drained retirement accounts, incurring substantial penalties, maxed out credit cards, taken personal loans at predatory interest rates, all to support a son who, at 29, still lived in their basement, worked sporadically as a substitute teacher, and by all evidence, contributed nothing to the household expenses. "Where is Mason now?" I asked, looking up from the devastating financial statements spread across the kitchen table. My father glanced toward the basement door. "He's resting. The situation with your mother has been hard on him." Hard on him. I bit back a bitter laugh. My 30-year-old brother was resting, while our mother struggled through rehab exercises. Our father balanced caregiving with mounting financial pressure, and I had put my career on pause to sort through the wreckage of their finances. "I need to speak with him," I said, rising from the table. The basement had been converted into a comfortable apartment for Mason years earlier, another expense my parents could ill afford. I found my brother sprawled on a sectional sofa, gaming, headset on, oblivious to the crisis unfolding upstairs. "Mason?" I said, standing directly in his line of sight to the television. He glanced up, irritated at the interruption, then registered my presence with mild surprise. "Oh, hey Eliza. When did you get here?" "Yesterday. Mom's therapy session. Just finished. You might want to check in on her." He nodded vaguely, making no move to pause his game. "Yeah, I will. In a bit. It's pretty depressing seeing her like that, you know?" I studied my brother. This person who had been placed at the center of our family universe for as long as I could remember. He wasn't malicious or cruel. He didn't actively wish anyone harm. He was simply accustomed to a world organized around his needs and limitations. "We need to talk about the situation," I said, picking up the remote and turning off the television despite his protest. "Hey, I was in the middle of... Mom and Dad are broke, Mason, completely broke. The stroke has pushed them over the edge financially. Do you understand what that means?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Dad said you were helping with that." "I'm assessing the situation," I corrected. "And part of that assessment involves understanding what you contribute to this household." His expression turned defensive. "I help out. I do chores and stuff, run errands for Mom." "And financially?" I pressed. "Rent, utilities, groceries?" "I can't afford much right now," he muttered. Substitute teaching doesn't pay well, and it's not consistent. Dad understands that. Dad can't afford to understand that anymore, I said bluntly. Neither can Mom. Things are going to change around here, Mason. Significantly. His face hardened with an expression I recognized from childhood. The look that preceded a tantrum, the precursor to the emotional storms that had always resulted in my parents capitulating to his demands. You can't just waltz in here after barely visiting for years and start making rules, he said. This is my home. It's a home that's about to be foreclosed on if serious changes aren't made, I countered. Mom needs specialized care. Their health insurance has denied half the treatments her doctors recommend. The mortgage is 3 months behind. There are no more assets to liquidate, no more credit to extend. Fear flickered across his face. Perhaps the first recognition that the safety net he'd relied on his entire life was now full of holes. What? What are you saying? I'm saying it's time for you to stand on your own feet. I'm looking at apartments within your budget. You'll need to take on more teaching assignments, possibly a second job. You have 2 weeks to find a place and move out. He stared at me in disbelief. You can't be serious. I can't afford to live on my own. And Mom needs help here. Mom needs professional care that I'm arranging and paying for, I interrupted. What she doesn't need is another dependent draining resources she and Dad no longer have. This is because of the college thing, isn't it? He snapped. You're still bitter about that after all these years. It's pathetic, Eliza. I felt an old familiar pain at his words, but it was duller now, distanced by time and perspective. This isn't about the past, Mason. It's about the present reality. Mom and Dad sacrificed everything for you, including my education, yes, but also their financial security, their retirement, their future. That fact doesn't fill their refrigerator or pay their medical bills. So you're punishing me? I shook my head, suddenly weary of this familiar dance. No, I'm refusing to enable you. There's a difference. Upstairs, I heard my father calling for assistance. I turned to leave, then paused at the bottom of the stairs. The world doesn't owe you special accommodation, Mason. Neither do our parents, and neither do I. It's time to join the rest of us in adult reality. Over the next 2 weeks, I initiated a comprehensive overhaul of my parents' situation. I negotiated with creditors, restructured payment plans, arranged for the sale of their few remaining assets, and established a trust to manage the funds I would contribute toward my mother's care. I hired a part-time caregiver to supplement what my father could provide, scheduled necessary home modifications for accessibility, and found a younger physical therapist who believed in a more aggressive recovery approach than the hospital had recommended. Through it all, my parents oscillated between gratitude for my help and discomfort at the shifts in our family dynamic. They had been the authority figures, the decision-makers. Now they were dependent on the daughter they had deemed capable of managing without their support. You don't have to do all this, my father said one evening as I reviewed insurance appeals at the kitchen table. Someone has to, I replied without looking up. You and Mom are underwater financially. Mason is clearly not stepping up. That leaves me. He was quiet for a moment. We never meant for things to turn out this way. I finally looked at him. This man who had once seemed so authoritative, whose decisions had altered the course of my life. He looked older than his 64 years, worn down by worry and care. What did you think would happen? I asked, genuinely curious. When you spent everything on Mason, when you mortgaged your future for his present? What was the long-term plan? He sighed heavily. We thought he would eventually find his footing, become independent. We were just trying to give him a fair chance given his challenges. And you thought I didn't need a fair chance? The question slipped out before I could contain it, the wounded child within me momentarily overriding my professional composure. My father looked stricken. You were always so capable, Eliza, so determined. We knew you would find a way to succeed no matter what obstacles you faced. That doesn't mean I should have had to face unnecessary obstacles, I said quietly. Being capable doesn't mean being undeserving of support. We sat in silence, the weight of past decisions hanging between us. I am sorry, he finally said, the words clearly difficult for him. For what it's worth. I nodded, accepting the apology without indicating whether it was sufficient. In truth, I didn't know myself. Some wounds healed, others merely scabbed. Over, remaining tender to the touch. The movers are coming for Mason's things tomorrow, I said, changing the subject. The apartment is ready for him. First month's rent and security deposit are paid. My father looked toward the basement. He's still saying he won't go. He doesn't have a choice, I replied simply. This house can barely support you and Mom now. There's no room, financially or practically, for a third adult who contributes nothing. The confrontation I expected with Mason never materialized. When I arrived the next morning with the moving company, he was sullenly packing his gaming equipment, having apparently accepted the inevitability of the situation overnight. I don't have furniture, he muttered as the movers began transferring boxes. The apartment comes with basics, I replied. Bed, dresser, table, chairs. You can gradually acquire what else you need as you work more hours. He shot me a resentful, look. Easy for you to say. You're a big-shot architect now. I regarded my brother steadily. I'm a big-shot architect because I worked 80-hour weeks for years, because I took out loans and lived on ramen to get my degree, because when no one gave me anything, I built it myself. You're going to throw that in my face forever, aren't you? He snapped. Poor Eliza had to pay for her own college while I got everything handed to me. It wasn't my fault Mom and Dad made that choice. No, it wasn't, I agreed, surprising. Him. The choice was theirs. But your continued dependence as an adult? That is your responsibility. And it ends today. As the movers carried out the last of his possessions, I handed him a folder. This contains your lease agreement, which runs month to month. Your budget based on your current income. A list of places hiring in your area that work with substitute teaching schedules. And information on certification programs that could qualify you for full-time teaching if you're interested. He took the folder reluctantly. I didn't ask for your help managing my life. No, you just expected everyone else to manage it for you indefinitely, I replied. Consider this a transitional phase. In 6 months, you'll be fully responsible for all your expenses. I suggest you use this time wisely. As Mason left with the movers, I felt no triumph or vindication. This wasn't about punishing him for being the favored child. It was about breaking patterns that had damaged our entire family, patterns that had left my parents financially devastated in their vulnerable later years, and my brother ill-equipped for adult independence. The practical changes were only the beginning. The more significant challenge was reshaping the emotional dynamics that had defined our family for decades. My parents still instinctively worried more about Mason's adjustment to his apartment than my mother's recovery progress. They still bristled when I implemented financial guardrails to prevent them from slipping back into enabling behaviors. Old habits died hard. One evening, about a month into this new arrangement, I found my mother sitting alone on the back porch, watching the sunset. Her mobility had improved somewhat with the intensive therapy, though she would likely always walk with a cane. "Mind some company?" I asked, settling into the chair beside her. She shook her head, then hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking about what your father told me, about your conversation regarding college." I tensed involuntarily. We had maintained an unspoken agreement not to directly address the decisions that had altered my educational path. "I want you to know," she continued carefully, "that we truly believed we were doing what was necessary at the time. Mason's diagnosis. The specialists all said early intervention was critical, that without the right support, he might never become independent." I absorbed her words, recognizing the painful irony. And yet, with all that support, he still struggled with independence. Did you ever wonder if perhaps giving him everything actually prevented him from developing the skills he needed? Her expression fell. "We were so focused on his limitations that we may have overlooked his capabilities, just as we were so focused on your capabilities that we overlooked your needs." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of the fundamental imbalance that had shaped our family that I had ever heard from her. "I'm not here to relitigate the past," I said gently. "What's done is done. I built my career despite the obstacles. But I do need you and Dad to understand why the changes I'm implementing are necessary, not just financially, but for Mason's sake too." She nodded slowly. "He called earlier. Said he figured out how to fix his leaky faucet himself instead of calling the landlord. A small thing, but significant for someone who had always had others solve his problems. That's progress." We sat in companionable silence as the sky deepened from orange to purple. For the first time in years, I felt a tentative bridge forming between my mother and me, not built on the old dynamics of unmet expectations and unacknowledged hurt, but on a new, more honest foundation. "I'm proud of you, Eliza," she said suddenly, "not just for your success, but for who you've become. For your strength, for being here now, despite everything." The words I had longed to hear for so many years landed differently than I had imagined they would. They didn't heal the old wounds completely, but they acknowledged them, which was its own form of balm. "I'm here because it's the right thing to do," I replied. "Not because I've forgotten, but because I've moved beyond it." My mother reached for my hand, her grip weaker than I remembered, but her intent clear. We weren't starting over. Too much had happened for that. But perhaps we were starting something new, something that acknowledged both the painful past and the possibility of a different future. As darkness fell completely, I helped her back inside, both of us navigating this unfamiliar territory of radical honesty and restructured expectations. The journey ahead would be complicated, the old patterns difficult to fully break. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that healing, however imperfect, might be possible. Not because my parents had suddenly become different people, not because the past could be erased, but because I had become strong enough to engage with them on my terms, from a place of security rather than need. The college fund they had redirected had altered my path, forcing me to climb a steeper road than necessary. But that road had led me to a strength and resilience I might never have discovered otherwise. That night, as I reviewed architectural Plans sent from my Chicago office, I recognized a parallel between structural rehabilitation and family reconstruction. Both required honest assessment of damage. Both demanded strategic reinforcement of weakened areas. Both necessitated patience and precision. And both were ultimately worth the effort if the foundation remained sound enough to build upon. 3. Months into my unexpected return to Mapleton, I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home, reviewing a spreadsheet of my mother's medical expenses. The morning sunlight streamed through windows I'd recently replaced, part of the home improvements I'd funded to make the house more accessible and energy efficient. The renovation crew had finished last week, transforming the dated space into something functional and bright. These numbers are encouraging, I murmured to myself, noting how the specialized therapy I'd arranged was yielding measurable improvements in my mother's mobility. The investment was substantial, but the results justified every penny. "Talking to yourself again?" My father entered, carrying a stack of mail. "You always did that as a little girl. Used to have entire conversations with yourself while building those elaborate block cities." The casual observation caught me off guard. A rare acknowledgement of my childhood passions before architecture became my profession. For a moment, I glimpsed the father I'd adored before family dynamics fractured our relationship. "Some habits stick," I replied, closing my laptop. "How was Mom's morning session?" "Better." She walked from the bedroom to the living room with just the cane. No walker. Pride and relief mingled in his voice. "That new therapist you found is a miracle. Worker." "Not a miracle. Just someone who believes in pushing boundaries instead of accepting limitations." I poured us both coffee, sliding his mug across the counter. "Speaking of which, have you heard from Mason?" My father's expression tightened slightly. "He called yesterday, said he's picking up more substituting hours next week." "Good, that's progress." I kept my tone neutral, though internally I celebrated this small step toward responsibility. The transition hadn't been easy for any of us. The first week after Mason moved to his own apartment had been a storm of angry calls and texts, mostly directed at me. I was cruel, unfair, vindictive, punishing him for being the favored child all these years. When emotional manipulation failed to sway me, he'd turn to our father, expecting the usual rescue. To my father's credit, he had held firm. Perhaps the first time he'd enforced a boundary with Mason in decades. "This arrangement is necessary," he'd told my brother. "Your sister is helping us, but we all need to adjust to new realities." Those new realities had been difficult for everyone to accept. For my parents, it meant acknowledging the consequences of years of financial choices that had prioritized Mason's needs over their own security. For Mason, it meant confronting adulthood, without the safety net that had always caught him. And for me, it meant balancing professional obligations in Chicago with family responsibilities in Mapleton, while processing complicated emotions about my newfound position of authority in the family. I sipped my coffee, studying my father over the rim of my mug. He looked better than he had when I'd first arrived, less haunted, more rested. The home health aide I'd hired to assist 4 days a week had eased his caregiver burden considerably. "I've been thinking," I said carefully. "It's been 3 months since I took emergency leave from the firm. I need to make some decisions about my professional future." My father's face fell slightly. "You're going back to Chicago?" "Not entirely," I replied. "I've been discussing options with the partners. They've agreed to let me open a satellite office here in Pennsylvania, a small team that would handle projects in the eastern region." I'd split my time between Chicago and here, at least for the next year while Mom's recovery continues. Surprise replaced his disappointment. You'd do that? Upend your career for us? I'm not upending it. I'm evolving it. I pulled up a presentation on my laptop, turning the screen toward him. Look at these projects we've been awarded in Philadelphia and New York. The firm has wanted an East Coast presence for years. This actually accelerates my career trajectory while allowing me to be present for your and Mom's needs. He studied the architectural renderings with genuine interest. These are your designs? They're remarkable, Eliza. The hospital renovation is mine, I said, pointing to a model of a modernized medical facility. It incorporates everything. I've learned about healthcare spaces from Mom's recovery journey. Environments that heal rather than merely house treatment. Something shifted in my father's expression. A recognition, perhaps, of who I had become despite rather than because of my circumstances. Of how I had transformed obstacles into opportunities, limitations into launching points. I'm sorry. We weren't there, he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. For your graduation, for so many moments when you deserved support. The apology, unexpected and unqualified, landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples that spread through years of accumulated hurt. I had neither sought nor anticipated this acknowledgement, having long ago stopped expecting my parents to recognize the inequity of their choices. I needed to hear that, I admitted quietly. More than I realized. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past present, but somehow less suffocating than before. Does Mom know about your plan to stay? He finally asked. I shook my head. Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first. He smiled slightly. She'll be relieved. She worries you resent being pulled back here. I did at first, I acknowledged, but I've come to see this time differently. It's not just about helping you. And Mom, it's about healing something that's been broken in our family for a long time. Including, I didn't add, my relationship with my brother. Mason and I had maintained a careful distance since his move, our interactions limited to necessary coordination about our parents' care. The resentment lingering between us was a wound that would take longer to address, if it ever could be. Later that afternoon, I visited Mason's apartment for the first time since helping him move in. The modest one-bedroom in a converted older home was sparsely furnished, but surprisingly neat, a contrast to the chaotic space he'd maintained in our parents' basement. He opened the door with visible reluctance. If you're here to check if I'm living up to your standards, save yourself the trouble. Actually, I brought lunch, I replied, holding up a bag from the local deli. And some information I thought might interest you. His suspicion didn't fade, but hunger won out. He stepped aside, letting me enter. The small living room contained only essential furniture, the basics I'd arranged when he'd moved in, but I noticed small personalizations emerging. Photographs tacked to walls, a collection of swimming trophies arranged on a bookshelf, a potted plant by the window. You've made it your own, I observed, setting the food on his small kitchen table. Mason shrugged, but I detected a hint of pride beneath the affected indifference. It's nothing special. It doesn't have to be special to be yours, I countered, unpacking sandwiches and drinks. That's the point of independence, creating a space that reflects your choices, not someone else's vision for you. He shot me a look that suggested I was being condescending, but took the offered sandwich without comment. We ate in awkward silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. "Dad says your fancy firm is letting you work from here part-time." I nodded. "I'm opening a regional office. It's a good opportunity professionally, and it lets me stay involved in Mom's recovery." "So you're not just the perfect daughter, but the perfect architect too," he muttered. But the usual venom was diluted, almost habitual rather than heartfelt. I studied my brother, this person who had been the son our family orbited for so long, now struggling to find his place in a newly reconfigured universe. Behind his resentment, I recognized something familiar. The disorientation of having to redefine yourself when old patterns no longer served. "I brought something besides lunch," I said, pulling a folder from my bag. "The school district is offering a certification program for substitute teachers to become full-time staff. It's accelerated, 6 months of evening classes while you continue substituting, full benefits and a steady paycheck at the end." Mason stared at the brochure, suspicion giving way to cautious interest. "Why would you bring me this?" "Because despite everything, you're good with kids. Your principal mentioned it when I ran into her at Mom's therapy center. She said you connect with the difficult students in ways other subs don't." He ducked his head, but not before I caught the flicker of pleasure at the unexpected praise. "It's nothing special." "There you go again," I said, allowing a smile to soften my words. "Some things are special even if you don't recognize their value. Your ability to reach struggling students is one of them." The silence that followed was different, contemplative rather than hostile. "I can't afford the certification program," he finally said, pushing the brochure back toward me. "Even with more substitute hours." "There's a scholarship," I replied, sliding a highlighted application across the table. "For candidates with experience working with learning differences. Your own history gives you perspective the selection committee values." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Did you arrange this?" I inquired about the program. The scholarship exists independently of my involvement. I held his gaze steadily. "This isn't charity, Mason. It's information, a potential path forward that aligns with your actual strengths, not the limitations everyone has always focused on." He studied the application, conflict evident on his face. "Why would you help me after everything?" The question carried layers of meaning. After our parents' favoritism, after years of inequity, after his initial anger at my intervention in the family's finances. Because breaking destructive patterns isn't just about changing where you live or how bills get paid, I said carefully. It's about creating new possibilities for everyone involved, including you. I stood, gathering the lunch debris. "The application deadline is next Friday. It's your decision entirely." As I reached the door, Mason called after me. "Eliza, thanks. For lunch and the other thing." It wasn't reconciliation. Too much lay unresolved between us for that. But it was acknowledgement. A small crack in the wall of antagonism that had defined our relationship for decades. "You're welcome," I replied simply, and left him to make his own choice. By my 6th month back in Mapleton, significant changes had transformed both the physical landscape of my parents' home and the emotional terrain of our family. My mother had progressed from wheelchair to walker to cane, her determination in therapy sessions rivaling the focus I'd once poured into my education. My father had found purpose in a part-time position teaching architecture appreciation at the community center, a connection I'd facilitated that leveraged his dormant passion for design. And Mason had, somewhat to my surprise, applied for and received the teaching certification scholarship. The satellite office I'd established was thriving, with 2 junior architects relocated from Chicago and a local administrative assistant creating a small but effective team. I'd converted a vacant downtown storefront into a modern workspace, bringing a touch of contemporary design to Mapleton's traditional main street. The renovation had generated positive press for both the firm and the town, leading to inquiries about additional commercial rejuvenation projects. My life had found an unexpected rhythm. 3 weeks in Mapleton, 1 week in Chicago, balancing family obligations with professional responsibilities in a way I'd never imagined possible. The arrangement wasn't permanent, but it was sustainable. For now, allowing me to guide my parents toward financial recovery while maintaining my career momentum. What I hadn't anticipated was how this temporary solution would reshape my understanding of success and fulfillment. In Chicago, I had pursued achievement with single-minded focus, measuring progress in promotions, awards, and square footage of increasingly prestigious living spaces. My worth had been quantified in professional accolades, my validation external and achievement-oriented. Here in Mapleton, different metrics emerged. Success meant my mother walking unassisted to the mailbox. It meant my father rediscovering joy in sharing his knowledge with eager students. It meant Mason showing up for family dinner with news about his certification progress instead of complaints about his circumstances. And most surprisingly, it meant reconciling with parts of myself I'd left behind in my determination to prove my parents wrong about my potential. One evening, I found myself in my childhood bedroom, now converted to a combination guest room and home office. While searching for additional storage space, I discovered a box of architectural sketches from high school. Elaborate designs for everything from sustainable housing communities to reimagined public spaces. I sat cross-legged on the floor, spreading the yellowed papers around me. The raw talent was evident, but what struck me most was the idealism infused in every design. Buildings that served communities, spaces that fostered connection, environments that elevated rather than merely contained human experience. Somewhere in my drive to succeed at any cost, to prove my worth through achievement, I had narrowed my vision. The prestigious projects I now led were technically brilliant and aesthetically striking, but they often lacked the soul of these early drawings. "I remember those," my mother said from the doorway, leaning on her cane. "You used to spend hours at that little desk, drawing cities of the future." I looked up, surprised both by her presence and her memory of my childhood passion. "I didn't think you noticed." She eased herself carefully onto the edge of the bed. "We noticed more than you think, Eliza. We just didn't always know how to support what we saw." The admission hung between us, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of awareness that somehow made their choices more rather than less painful. "You supported Mason," I said quietly, gathering the sketches into a neat pile. My mother sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. "We thought we were doing what was necessary. The specialists painted such a dire picture of his future without intensive intervention. We became so focused on what he might never achieve that we lost sight of what you could become with proper support." I stood, placing the sketches on the desk. "I became this anyway." "Yes," she agreed, a complex mixture of pride and regret in her voice. "You did. Despite rather than because of our choices." She reached for my hand, her grip frailer than I remembered but insistent. "I want you to know something. Watching you these past months, the way you've handled everything, built something new here while maintaining your Chicago life, even found ways to help your brother toward independence. I realize we underestimated you in the worst possible way." I stilled, unexpected emotion tightening my throat. "We didn't just underestimate your ability to succeed without our financial support," she continued. "We underestimated your capacity for compassion, for forgiveness, for finding solutions where others see only problems." Her eyes, clouded with medication but clear in purpose, held mine. "Those qualities weren't formed by adversity, Eliza. They were always in you. We just failed to nurture them." The validation I had stopped seeking years ago washed over me. Meaningful not because I needed it to know my worth, but because it represented growth I hadn't thought possible in our relationship. "I'm not the same person who left Mapleton," I said carefully. "That girl was defined by what she lacked: parental support, financial resources, recognition. The woman I've become is defined by what she's built despite those absences." My mother nodded slowly. "And now you're helping us rebuild. There's a symmetry there that isn't lost on me." The observation was perceptive, acknowledging the reversal of dependencies without diminishing either the past injury or the present healing. "It's not about evening the score," I told her, something I'd been realizing gradually over these months. "It's about breaking cycles that harm everyone involved." That night, I called Sophia Mercer from the back porch, the same spot where I'd once dreamed of escaping Mapleton for bigger opportunities. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, comforting in its familiarity. "The Philadelphia Hospital project has generated significant interest," she informed me, her voice crisp even through the phone. "The board is particularly impressed with your integration of rehabilitation considerations into the general patient spaces. They're calling it revolutionary." "It's drawing on personal experience," I replied, thinking of my mother's journey through various institutional settings. How small design failures had impeded recovery while thoughtful elements had accelerated healing. Sometimes proximity to a problem reveals solutions invisible from a distance. Sophia was quiet for a moment. "You've changed since taking on this satellite office arrangement, Eliza. Your work has always been technically impeccable, but these recent designs have something more. A humanity that's connecting with clients on a deeper level." Her observation aligned with my own reflections on those rediscovered high school sketches. The return of a purposefulness that had been subordinated to pure achievement in my desperate climb to professional validation. "I've been thinking about the firm's community impact initiative," I said, voicing an idea that had been forming for weeks. "What if we expanded it to include a scholarship program for students from disadvantaged backgrounds interested in architectural careers? Full tuition plus mentorship through the entire educational journey." "That's a significant commitment," Sophia noted, though I detected interest beneath her measured response. "What inspired this?" "The talent that never gets developed because of financial barriers," I replied simply. "The voices missing from our field because they couldn't afford the entry fee." After we hung up, I remained on the porch, contemplating how my journey had come full circle in unexpected ways. The college fund that should have launched me directly into higher education had been diverted, forcing me onto a harder path. Yet that very detour had shaped me into someone capable of creating opportunities for others facing similar obstacles. The irony wasn't lost on me. My parents' decision to redirect my education fund to Mason had been devastating, altering my trajectory and straining our relationship for years. Yet the resilience I'd developed navigating that unfairness had ultimately prepared me to handle the current family crisis with clarity and purpose. This wasn't about forgetting the injury or pretending it hadn't mattered. It was about recognizing how even painful experiences could be integrated into a meaningful narrative, one where suffering produced growth and obstacles created opportunities for transformation. The following weekend brought an unexpected milestone. Mason had completed his first month of certification courses and invited our parents and me to a small celebration dinner at his apartment. The invitation itself represented significant evolution, acknowledgement that his progress deserved recognition and that our family, despite its complicated history, remained important in his life. His apartment showed further signs of personalization: bookshelves filled with education texts, walls adorned with posters about learning strategies, a desk covered with course materials. He had prepared a simple meal, nothing elaborate but made with evident care and attention. The program director thinks I could specialize in working with kids who have learning differences similar to mine, he told us as we ate. Says my personal experience gives me insight other teachers might miss. I watched my parents' reactions carefully. In the past, they had responded to any mention of Mason's challenges with protective defensiveness, as if acknowledging his difficulties was tantamount to condemning him to limitation. Tonight, I saw something different: cautious pride in his ability to transform personal struggle into professional strength. "That makes perfect sense," my father said, refilling water glasses. "You understand the frustration these kids feel in ways someone without your experience couldn't." Mason glanced at me, perhaps expecting skepticism, but I nodded agreement. The most effective teachers are often those who had to work harder to master the material themselves. They remember what it's like not to understand, so they explain more thoroughly. "Exactly," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice at my support. That's what my advisor said, almost word for word. The conversation flowed more easily than any family interaction I could remember. Not because we were ignoring the complicated dynamics between us, but because we were relating to each other as the adults we had become, rather than the roles we had once occupied. After dinner, while our parents examined Mason's course materials with interest, he joined me in the small kitchen area as I rinsed dishes. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted quietly. "But you were right about the apartment, about needing to stand on my own." I handed him a plate to dry. "It wasn't about being right, Mason. It was about recognizing patterns that were hurting everyone, you included." He was silent for a moment, methodically drying the plate. "For what it's worth, I get it now. Why you were so angry about the college fund. It wasn't just about the money." "No," I agreed. "It was about what the decision represented, that my dreams were considered optional while yours were deemed essential." He nodded slowly. "I never asked them to make that choice." "I know." And I did know. Had always known that Mason hadn't orchestrated the favoritism that had defined our childhood. He had simply accepted the role assigned to him, just as I had accepted mine. "I'm not sure I could have done what you did," he continued, his voice low enough that our parents couldn't hear from the living room. "Put myself through school like that. Built a career with no support." The admission startled me, not because it was true, but because it represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't witnessed in my brother before. "You haven't had the opportunity to discover what you're capable of," I replied carefully. "That's what this new chapter is about. Finding out who Mason is beyond the labels and limitations everyone, including yourself, has accepted." He met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time in our adult lives. I'm sorry for how I acted when you first came back, for not seeing that you were trying to help. The apology, unexpected and unqualified, created a small opening, not for instant reconciliation, but for the possibility of a relationship built on mutual respect rather than shared history alone. We're all learning new ways to be a family, I said simply. It's unfamiliar territory for everyone. That night, driving my parents home from Mason's apartment, I caught my mother wiping away tears. "Are you in pain?" I asked, immediately concerned about her still recovering condition. She shook her head. "Just overwhelmed. Seeing him in his own place, talking about a real future. I never thought it was possible. You never gave him the chance to show you what was possible," I observed, keeping my tone gentle despite the truth's sharpness. Sometimes support means stepping back enough to let someone discover their own capabilities. My father reached across the seat to take her hand. "We made mistakes with both of you. Different ones, but equally damaging in their ways." The acknowledgement hung in the air, not erasing the past, but creating space for a different future. We rode in contemplative silence for several minutes before my mother spoke again. "What happens when your year here is up, Eliza? When I'm fully recovered and the finances are stabilized?" The question reflected a fear I recognized, that the fragile rebuilding of our family would collapse once the immediate crisis passed. That I would return fully to my Chicago life, maintaining the emotional distance that had defined our relationship for years. "I don't know exactly," I answered honestly, "but it won't be like before. Some bridges once built remain even when the immediate need for crossing has passed." As we pulled into their driveway, I realized the metaphor wasn't just comfortable professional language. It reflected a deeper truth about the work of these past months. I had been building bridges between past and present, between injury and healing, between the family we had been and the one we might yet become. The architecture of reconciliation was perhaps the most challenging design problem I had ever tackled. It required understanding structural weaknesses without condemning the entire foundation. It demanded materials strong enough to bear the weight of difficult truths, yet flexible enough to accommodate growth and change. It necessitated patience, precision, and a vision that looked beyond current limitations to future possibilities. But like any worthwhile architectural challenge, the difficulty of execution didn't diminish the value of the endeavor. Some structures were worth building precisely because they seemed impossible at first glance. As I helped my mother from the car, steadying her as she navigated the walkway I'd redesigned for accessibility, I recognized that the path forward, for all of us, would never be perfectly straight or entirely smooth. There would be missteps and backward slides, old patterns reasserting themselves in moments of stress or uncertainty, yet something fundamental had shifted in our family's foundation. The careful reconstructive work of these months had created possibility where once there had been only rigid roles and accumulated grievances. We were learning, however imperfectly, to see each other as we were, rather than as the parts we had been assigned in a dysfunctional system. That night, as I reviewed plans for the Philadelphia hospital project, I found myself incorporating elements inspired by my family's journey. Transition spaces that eased movement between different environments, support structures that enabled independence rather than fostering dependence, design features that accommodated healing's nonlinear nature. The daughter whose educational dreams had once been sacrificed was now creating healing spaces informed by that very experience of loss and recovery. The architectural vision I had nearly abandoned in my desperate drive to prove my worth had matured and deepened through reconnection with the community that had both wounded and shaped me. There was poetry in that evolution, not the neat resolution of a fairy tale, but the complex harmony of a life where even profound injuries could be integrated into a meaningful whole, where the broken places, properly tended, could become sources of unique strength and insight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, continued negotiations with insurance companies, Mason's ongoing adjustment to independence, my parents' gradual adaptation to financial reality, my own balancing of professional ambitions with family obligations. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I allowed myself to recognize how far we had all traveled from the devastating scene in my parents' kitchen 12 years earlier, when a college fund's redirection had altered trajectories and strained bonds in ways none of us could have anticipated. The money that should have launched my education had instead funded Mason's special programs. Now, the career I had built despite that obstacle was providing resources to reconstruct our family's foundation and future. The symmetry wasn't perfect, but it was meaningful, a reminder that even the most painful chapters could contribute to a story worth telling. Not because suffering was necessary for growth, but because growth remained possible even after suffering. Not because injustice was ever justified, but because response to injustice could transcend mere survival to create transformation. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I glanced at the high school sketches I'd rediscovered, now pinned to my bulletin board as a reminder of architectural purpose beyond prestige and profit. They represented a vision I had nearly lost in my desperate climb from financial disadvantage to professional security, a belief that built environments could foster healing, connection, and opportunity. That vision, temporarily obscured, but never fully abandoned, now informed not just my professional designs but my approach to restructuring family dynamics as well. The architecture of reconciliation required the same essential elements as any worthwhile building: a solid foundation, thoughtful planning, quality materials, and perhaps most importantly, the courage to envision something that didn't yet exist. Tomorrow I would continue that work, one careful adjustment at a time. 1 year after my emergency return to Mapleton, I stood on the rooftop terrace of the renovated Phillips building, surveying the transformation unfolding in my hometown's downtown district. The building, once a neglected 1920s department store, now housed my architectural firm's thriving eastern office on the top floor, with a community arts center and affordable studio spaces for local entrepreneurs below. Lights twinkled on throughout the revitalized Main Street as dusk settled over the small town I'd once been so desperate to escape. Quite a view, isn't it? Sophia Mercer joined me at the railing, champagne flute in hand. My mentor and the firm's founder had flown in from Chicago for tonight's official opening celebration. When you proposed a satellite office in your hometown, I expected something modest. This is remarkable, Eliza. I smiled, watching people arriving for the evening's event. The building was being considered for demolition. All it needed was someone to see the potential beneath the decay. A fitting metaphor for your whole approach this past year, she observed shrewdly, seeing potential where others saw only problems. The Phillips building had been the first of several rehabilitation projects I'd initiated in Mapleton, part of a broader vision that had emerged during my months navigating my family's crisis. What had begun as a temporary solution to balance professional obligations with family responsibilities had evolved into something more purposeful, a reimagining of community spaces that fostered connection, opportunity, and healing. The scholarship program launches next month, I told her, referring to the initiative we'd founded to support architectural students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The local high school has 3 promising candidates already. Sophia nodded, approvingly. The board is impressed with the community engagement model you've pioneered here. They're talking about implementing similar approaches in other mid-sized markets. My assistant appeared at the terrace entrance, signaling that guests were arriving for the reception. Before heading inside, I took a final moment to appreciate the view, not just of the physical transformation below, but of the journey that had brought me to this unexpected inflection point. A year ago, I had returned to Mapleton under duress, summoned by a family crisis that threatened to derail the carefully constructed independence I'd built. Now I stood poised between 2 worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable: the high-powered career I'd fought to create and the hometown connections I'd thought severed forever. The integration hadn't been seamless. There had been difficult moments, painful reckonings, and necessary boundaries established. But standing here now, I recognized that what had initially felt like a detour had actually created a more meaningful path, one that honored both where I'd come from and who I'd become. Inside, the reception space buzzed with a diverse mix of attendees, my Chicago colleagues, local business owners, community leaders, and family. My mother moved carefully through the crowd, still using a cane, but remarkably recovered from her stroke. My father engaged animatedly with a group discussing the Arts Center's potential impact. And in a corner near the architectural displays, Mason was deep in conversation with his school principal and the education director from the community college. There's the visionary herself. Mayor Dawson approached, extending her hand. The council just approved the next phase of the downtown revitalization plan. Your presentation last month sealed the deal. That's wonderful news, I replied, genuinely pleased. The comprehensive plan we'd developed went beyond aesthetic improvements to address affordable housing, accessible design, and sustainable infrastructure, elements often overlooked in small-town revitalization efforts. We've had 3 new businesses sign leases already, she continued enthusiastically, and the community college is seriously considering your proposal for the satellite campus in the old textile factory. As the mayor moved on to greet other guests, I caught sight of Dr. Reynolds, my mother's neurologist, deep in conversation with the lead designer from my healthcare team. I'd introduced them months earlier, after realizing that medical practitioners and architectural designers rarely collaborated directly, despite serving the same populations. Their ongoing dialogue had already influenced several innovations in our hospital renovation projects. You've created quite a ripple effect here, observed Jamila, the junior architect I'd recruited from Chicago to help establish the Eastern office. It's like you dropped a stone in still water, and the circles just keep expanding. Her metaphor was apt. What had begun as a narrowly focused intervention in my family's financial crisis had expanded to encompass community revitalization, educational opportunity, and healthcare design innovation. Each element connected to and reinforced the others, creating an integrated approach to renewal that transcended individual projects. As I circulated through the reception, accepting congratulations and discussing future initiatives, I found myself repeatedly drawn back to a fundamental realization. The very qualities that had enabled me to survive my parents' redirection of my college fund, resilience, resourcefulness, determination, were now being channeled into creating opportunities that would prevent others from facing similar obstacles. The scholarship program would ensure talented students didn't have to work 3 jobs while pursuing their education. The affordable studio spaces would give entrepreneurs platforms to launch without crippling overhead. The healthcare design innovations would create more effective recovery environments for patients like my mother. None of this erased the injury of that long-ago decision that had altered my educational trajectory. But it transformed the meaning of that experience from merely personal disappointment to the catalyst for systemic change. Later in the evening, I found a quiet moment with my mother in the small library off the main reception area. She had tired, somewhat from the social interaction, though she'd never admit it. "I'm so proud of you," she said, squeezing my hand. "Not just for all this." She gestured around the beautifully restored space. "But for who you've become. For your ability to transform difficulty into opportunity." I studied her face, noticing how the past year had aged her beyond the physical effects of the stroke. The financial reckoning, Mason's necessary independence, the restructuring of family dynamics, all had taken their toll. Yet there was also a clarity in her expression that hadn't been there before, a hard-won wisdom emerging from consequences finally faced. "I learned that from necessity," I replied honestly. "When my college fund disappeared, I had two choices: give up on my dreams or find another way to achieve them. That lesson shaped everything that followed." She winced slightly at the reference to the fund, though we'd discussed it more openly in recent months as part of our family's healing process. "If I could go back and make a different choice," she began. I shook my head gently. "We can't rewrite the past, Mom. And honestly, I'm not sure I would change it now even if I could. The path was harder than it needed to be, but it led me here to work that matters and the strength to create change rather than just survive it." It wasn't complete forgiveness. That would suggest the injury was insignificant, which it had not been. But it was something equally powerful: integration of that painful chapter into a meaningful narrative that honored both the difficulty and the growth it had ultimately inspired. "Your father and I have been talking," she said, changing the subject slightly. "We'd like to set up a small foundation with the proceeds from selling the vacation cabin. Something that would provide emergency grants to college students facing unexpected financial crises that might force them to drop out." The proposal caught me by surprise, not just the specific idea, but the initiative behind it. For the first time in our family history, my parents were acting proactively to address an injustice they had perpetuated, rather than merely acknowledging past mistakes. "That's actually a wonderful idea," I said thoughtfully. "We could structure it to provide gap funding for students who fall through institutional cracks. Too much income for full financial aid, but not enough for practical self-sufficiency." "Exactly." Her enthusiasm brightened her tired features. "Students like you were, who have the ability but face financial obstacles. We could call it the Bridge Fund." The name held perfect symbolism, not just for the students it would assist in crossing financial gaps, but for our family's ongoing work of building connections between past injuries and future possibilities. "I'd be happy to help establish it," I offered. "The firm has a nonprofit division that could provide pro bono legal and financial structuring." As we rejoined the main reception, I noticed Mason speaking with one of my Chicago colleagues near the architectural display featuring the community college expansion. His certification program had concluded 2 months earlier, and he now held a full-time teaching position working with students with learning differences. The transformation in his bearing was subtle but significant, a newfound confidence that came from earned achievement rather than entitled expectation. "Your brother was just telling me about his teaching approach," my colleague explained as we approached. Fascinating perspective on learning environments. I've been picking his brain for our educational facility designs. Mason looked simultaneously pleased and slightly embarrassed by the professional respect. I was just sharing some observations about how classroom layouts affect focus for students with attention issues. Nothing revolutionary. Actually, it is somewhat revolutionary, I countered, genuinely impressed. Most architects design educational spaces based on ideal students rather than diverse learning needs. Your practical insights could significantly improve functionality. He met my gaze directly, a small smile acknowledging the genuine professional recognition. Well, if you think it's useful, I'd be happy to consult on future projects. The exchange represented more than just professional courtesy. It marked a profound shift in our sibling dynamic. For the first time in our adult lives, we were relating as equals with distinct but valuable expertise, rather than as competitors in a zero-sum game of parental approval. That night, after the guests had departed and I'd said goodbye to my Chicago colleagues, I found myself alone on the rooftop terrace again. The town had quieted, streetlights illuminating the revitalized main street below. In the distance, I could see the modest neighborhood where I'd grown up, and just beyond it, the university where I now guest lectured occasionally in the architecture program. The past year had rewritten my understanding of success in unexpected ways. In Chicago, I had pursued achievement as a form of vindication. Each promotion, award, and professional recognition serving as evidence that my parents had been wrong to sacrifice my educational fund. My worth had been measured in external validation, my drive fueled partly by the need to prove something to people who weren't even present to witness it. Here in Mapleton, different metrics had emerged. Success meant creating systems that prevented others from facing the obstacles I had encountered. It meant using my professional platform to address community needs often overlooked by profit-driven development. It meant rebuilding family relationships based on present reality rather than past grievances. Most surprisingly, it meant discovering that helping my family navigate their crisis had healed something in me that achievement alone had never touched. The wounded part that had been telling the story of the forgotten daughter, the expendable child, for far too long. This wasn't the narrative of magical forgiveness or convenient amnesia regarding past injustice. It was the more complex story of reclaiming agency, of choosing to rewrite the meaning of difficult experiences rather than remaining defined by them. The college fund my parents had redirected to Mason had indeed altered my path, creating unnecessary hardship during my educational journey. That fact remained unchanged. But the meaning I assigned to that experience had transformed, from evidence of my expendability to the foundation of my unique perspective and capabilities. The following morning, I met with the local high school guidance counselor to finalize details for the architectural scholarship program launching the next month. 3 promising students had been identified as initial candidates, all talented designers facing financial barriers to higher education. These students would likely abandon their architectural ambitions without this opportunity, the counselor explained, reviewing their portfolios, especially Daria, single-parent household, 3 younger siblings, exceptional spatial reasoning, but no financial pathway to the university architectural program. I studied the girls' preliminary designs, raw but remarkably intuitive, showing an understanding of how built environments affected human experience that couldn't be taught. She's exactly who this program was created for. Talent that might otherwise be lost to financial circumstance. After the meeting, I drove to my parents' home for our weekly family dinner, a tradition established during my mother's recovery that had continued even as her health improved. The house had changed substantially over the past year, modified for accessibility and energy efficiency while preserving its essential character. Like our family itself, it had been restructured rather than demolished, its foundation sound enough to support necessary evolution. Mason arrived shortly after me, bringing a homemade dessert and animated stories about his students' progress. The dynamic between us remained a work in progress, moments of genuine connection interspersed with occasional tension when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But the trajectory was undeniably positive, our relationship recalibrating toward mutual respect rather than comparative valuation. "I've been invited to present at the state education conference," he announced as we gathered at the table. "A workshop on integrating movement-based learning for students with attention differences." "That's wonderful, Mason," our mother exclaimed, her pride evident, but no longer carrying the protective quality that had once defined her relationship with him. "Your personal experience combined with your teaching perspective offers something unique." "The Research Foundation called about your grant proposal," our father added. "They're interested in funding the pilot program at your school." I watched my brother absorb this professional recognition, noting how differently he carried himself, now compared to a year earlier. The dependent, entitled young man who had raged against being required to support himself had been replaced by someone finding genuine purpose in translating his own struggles into assistance for others. "Eliza helped me structure the proposal," he acknowledged, surprising me with the public credit. Her project management approach made a huge difference in organizing the research components. The simple acknowledgement represented significant growth, an ability to share credit that had been notably absent in our earlier family dynamic, where Mason had been positioned as the perpetual recipient of support rather than a contributor to others' success. After dinner, while our parents cleaned up, Mason and I sat on the back porch, the same space where I'd once contemplated the irony of being asked to rescue the family that had sacrificed my educational opportunities. "I've been thinking about something," he said, unusually hesitant. "About the college fund situation." I tensed slightly, uncertain where this might lead. We had acknowledged the issue in broad terms during family discussions about financial restructuring, but had never addressed it directly between ourselves. "I benefited from a decision that hurt you," he continued, his gaze fixed on the darkening yard. "I didn't make that decision, but I accepted its advantages without ever considering the cost to you." The straightforward acknowledgement caught me off guard. In our family's careful reckoning with past patterns, my parents had gradually recognized the inequity of their choices. But Mason had maintained a certain distance from personal responsibility, positioning himself as another recipient of our parents' dysfunctional decision-making rather than a beneficiary of my specific disadvantage. "You were a kid," I pointed out, 15 when they redirected the fund. "That decision wasn't yours to make." "No," he agreed. "But I was 22 when I dropped out of the private college they mortgaged their future to send me to. 25? When I moved back home instead of supporting myself. 29 when I let them keep draining their retirement to subsidize my lifestyle." He finally looked at me directly. "I may not have created the initial inequity, but I perpetuated it through my choices as an adult." The admission represented a level of self-awareness I wouldn't have thought possible a year earlier, evidence of the profound shift in his perspective since being required to stand on his own feet. "I can't change the past," he continued, "but I've set up a payment plan. $500 monthly from my teaching salary into an investment account in your name. It won't equal what was taken, but— Mason, that's not necessary, I interrupted, genuinely surprised by the gesture. I don't need financial restitution from you. It's not about what you need, he replied with unexpected insight. It's about acknowledging the reality of what happened. About taking responsibility for my part in a system that benefited me at your expense. His words echoed my own journey toward integrating difficult truths into a meaningful narrative. Not erasing painful realities, but transforming their significance through conscious action in the present. Put it toward the bridge fund instead, I suggested after consideration. Let it help students facing the kind of financial crisis I experienced. That would be more meaningful than personal repayment. He nodded slowly, accepting the redirection, while maintaining the commitment. I'd still like to do something specifically acknowledging what you lost. What about contributing to one of your community revitalization projects? The Arts Center needs funding for the youth program. The offer represented more than financial restitution. It signaled his recognition of my professional vision and a desire to support work that mattered to me. It was, in its way, a more meaningful acknowledgement than direct repayment could have been. The youth program would be perfect, I agreed. Especially the architecture component for middle schoolers. Catching them before they self-select out of creative fields they think aren't for people like them. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the conversation having shifted something subtle but significant in our relationship. Not erasing the past injustice, but creating a new context for moving forward, one that acknowledged both the reality of what had happened and the possibility of a different future. 2 weeks later, I stood in the classroom at Mapleton High School, facing 20 students gathered for the launch of the Architectural Mentorship Program, an initiative connected to the scholarship that would provide guidance and professional exposure to students considering design careers. Architecture isn't just about designing buildings, I began, noting the mix of enthusiasm and uncertainty on young faces. It's about creating spaces that shape human experience, that facilitate connection, learning, healing, growth. Every community needs voices that understand its unique challenges and possibilities. I moved toward the display of diverse architectural approaches we'd assembled, highlighting works from designers with varied backgrounds and perspectives. There's no single path to becoming an architect. Some follow traditional routes through prestigious universities. Others forge more unconventional paths, bringing insights from diverse experiences. As I watched a teenager patiently demonstrating planting techniques to an elderly neighbor, I recognized the power of designed environments to either reinforce existing barriers or create new possibilities for connection. My professional focus had evolved to prioritize the latter. Spaces that facilitated healing, learning, and community in ways that addressed fundamental human needs rather than merely aesthetic or commercial considerations. This evolution hadn't happened despite my difficult educational journey, but partly because of it. The experience of navigating institutional barriers with minimal support had developed a particular sensitivity to how environments either facilitated or hindered access and opportunity. The necessity of finding unconventional paths had fostered innovative approaches to seemingly intractable problems. The college fund my parents had redirected had indeed altered my trajectory, creating unnecessary hardship during a formative period. That reality remained unchanged. But the meaning I assigned to that experience had transformed. From evidence of my expendability to the foundation of a professional perspective, uniquely attuned to issues of access, opportunity, and resilience. And perhaps most significantly, the parents who had once deemed me capable of succeeding without their support had been proven both right and wrong. Right that I possessed the determination to overcome substantial obstacles. Wrong that this ability made their support unnecessary, or their choices without consequence. The daughter they had considered strong enough to survive without a college fund had indeed survived, and ultimately thrived. But that strength, rather than justifying their decision, had become the foundation for ensuring others wouldn't face similar unnecessary barriers. The very resilience forged through their failure of support now powered initiatives designed to provide the support they had withheld. There was profound irony in that evolution, but also a certain grace. The transformation of injury into insight, of obstacle into opportunity, of personal hardship into community benefit. Not because suffering was necessary for growth, but because growth remained possible even after suffering. As I left the garden and walked toward my parents' home for our weekly dinner, I reflected on the question Daria had asked during a recent mentoring session. How do you know if the harder path is worth it? My answer had emerged from the integration of my own experience. The harder path is rarely chosen willingly. But when circumstances force it upon you, the question becomes not whether it's worth it, but how to make it meaningful. How to transform the additional difficulty into unique perspective and purpose. The college fund that should have been mine had been redirected to my brother 12 years earlier. The parents who had made that choice now depended on my financial assistance and professional expertise. The symmetry was imperfect, but undeniable. Yet the resolution wasn't about evening scores or exacting revenge. It was about breaking dysfunctional patterns for everyone involved, empowering Mason toward genuine independence, guiding my parents toward financial reality, and liberating myself from the narrative of the forgotten daughter. Most importantly, it was about extending the circle of impact beyond our immediate family, creating opportunities for talented students who might otherwise face the same unnecessary barriers I had encountered, designing spaces that facilitated healing for patients navigating recovery journeys similar to my mother's, revitalizing communities that had been overlooked by conventional development approaches. The architecture of reconciliation, like any worthwhile design challenge, required both technical skill and emotional intelligence, an ability to assess structural damage honestly without condemning the entire foundation, to incorporate both existing elements and innovative solutions, to balance aesthetic vision with practical functionality. But perhaps most crucially, it demanded the courage to envision something that didn't yet exist. To believe that even profound injuries could be integrated into structures of meaning and purpose, that broken relationships could be rebuilt with greater wisdom and intention, that difficult journeys could lead to destinations worth reaching. As I approached my parents' home, now modified for accessibility and energy efficiency, while preserving its essential character, I recognized that same principle at work. Not demolition and replacement, but thoughtful adaptation that honored both history and future possibility. The path forward would continue to require careful navigation, honest communication, and occasional course correction. The reconstruction of trust happened one interaction at a time, one acknowledged truth at a time, one kept promise at a time. But the foundation, imperfect yet resilient, had proven sound enough to build upon. And the structure emerging, though different from anything I might have envisioned when first confronting my parents' financial crisis, contained elements of beauty and strength I couldn't have anticipated. Not because injustice was ever justified, but because response to injustice could transcend mere survival to create transformation. Not just for the individual who experienced the injury, but for the systems that had permitted or perpetuated it. The college fund they had redirected had altered my path, forcing me to climb a steeper road than necessary. But that road had led me to vantage points I might never have discovered otherwise, perspectives that now informed designs affecting thousands of lives, initiatives creating opportunities for a new generation of diverse voices in architecture, approaches to community development centered on inclusion rather than profit alone. As I entered my parents' home, greeted by the familiar scent of Sunday dinner and the sound of my brother's voice explaining some new teaching technique to our father, I recognized that the architecture of reconciliation, like any meaningful design, was never truly complete. It would require ongoing maintenance, occasional reinforcement, and adaptive modification to meet evolving needs. But the foundation had been established, the structure taking shape. And within its carefully designed spaces, new patterns were emerging, of mutual respect rather than hierarchical valuation, of individual agency rather than assigned roles, of authentic connection rather than performative harmony. Not the family. We had been, certainly, but perhaps in time the family we were capable of becoming,